A stranger steps out of the Lochdubh fog, carrying secrets heavy enough to bend the morning light, and by nightfall, those secrets will send ripples across the quiet village. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. The mist lay thick over Lochdubh that morning, the kind that softened the edges of the hills and made the cottages look half asleep. Hamish Macbeth stood at his crooked doorway with Lugs at his side, the dog shifting uneasily as if the damp air itself carried a warning. Hamish rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the chill that seeped through even his old jumper. The loch was a pale smear beyond the road, barely distinguishable from sky. It was the sort of morning where sounds travelled strangely, muffled as though the village had wrapped itself in wool. He had intended to make tea, but Lugs pawed insistently at the ground, wanting him outside. Hamish trusted the dog's instincts more than most people's words, so he stepped out into the quiet, letting the door drift shut behind him. He walked only a few paces before he noticed movement along the loch road. A lone figure came through the drifting grey, the shape wavering as though not quite committed to becoming solid. Lugs gave a soft warning rumble, and Hamish straightened, pushing his hands deep into his pockets. Visitors rarely arrived at this hour, and never walking in from that direction unless they were lost or troubled. As the figure drew closer, Hamish saw that it was a man of about his own age, dressed in clothes too fine for misty Highland travel. His coat was tailored, though creased as if he'd slept in it. His face was drawn, elegant, in a tired way, and his eyes darted about with wary calculation. "Morning," Hamish said with a nod, keeping his voice mild. The man blinked as if surprised to find someone materializing from the fog. Lugs stepped forward, nose lifted, reading the stranger's scent with solemn interest. The man swallowed, glanced at the dog, then at Hamish. "I'm looking for someone, sir," he said quietly. "Priscilla Halburton-Smythe." The name unsettled the morning more than any wind could. Hamish felt it like the faint sting of old injury, though he kept his expression neutral. "Aye," he replied. "What's your business with her?" The man looked down at the road. "We knew each other a long time ago. I need to see her." His voice held an educated English tone, softened by fatigue. He introduced himself only after a tense hesitation, as though the name was something breakable. "Andrew," he said at last, then added no surname. Hamish filed that away. Visitors rarely omitted their full names unless they carried troubles behind them. Lugs shifted closer to Hamish's leg, watching Andrew with polite suspicion. The mist thinned just enough for Hamish to see curtains twitching in nearby cottages. Lochdubh's gossip network was waking up, stretching, preparing to feast. "Priscilla's not in the village," Hamish said. "She's up at her parents' place." Andrew nodded as though expecting that, but he didn't turn toward the estate. Instead, he stared at the loch, lips tightening as if reconsidering everything. Hamish offered to show him to the hotel, thinking a cup of tea and warmth might loosen the man's reserve. Andrew accepted with a faint, strained smile. They walked together through the muted morning, Lugs trotting beside them. The ground was slick, and the salt smell of the loch mingled with peat smoke drifting from chimneys. At the hotel doorway, Andrew paused. "You've been very kind," he murmured, though his gaze seemed elsewhere, caught in some memory that pulled the colour from his face. "Priscilla doesn't know I'm here. I don't want to trouble her." Hamish shrugged lightly. "Folk come and go. Lochdubh can bear it." Andrew almost smiled, but the expression collapsed before forming. Inside, Hamish left him with the owner, who began the usual village interrogation, disguised as hospitality. Hamish stepped back out into the cold, lifting his collar against the creeping damp. He walked the moor path to clear his head, Lugs bounding ahead, pausing to sniff tufts of grass made heavy by mist. Hamish's thoughts drifted reluctantly toward Priscilla. There had always been a thin ache where she was concerned, never enough to disrupt his quiet life, but enough to linger in quiet moments. Andrew's appearance struck that ache like a stone hitting still water. He wondered what sort of past bound them, and why the man carried such tension on his face. As he walked, a faint drizzle began, the droplets forming tiny beads on Lugs's fur. The world turned grey again, dissolving outlines, softening reality into shapes that felt half-formed. By midday, the rain thickened slightly, tapping the tin roof of the police station in a steady rhythm. Hamish made a pot of tea and warmed his hands around the mug. When the phone rang, he answered absent-mindedly, expecting Blair or some tourist complaining about sheep. Instead it was Patel, voice low and curious. "That visitor of yours," Patel said. "The fancy-looking one. Did you say he checked in?" Hamish frowned. "Aye, the hotel owner took him." Patel clicked his tongue. "Funny that, because the room's still empty and the lad at the counter says he never came back after stepping outside." Hamish straightened, glancing at Luggs, who had lifted his head sharply. "Right," Hamish said. "I'll come round." He walked through the drizzle to Patel's shop, boots squelching on the wet road. Inside, the warm smell of spices and old paper welcomed him. Patel leaned over the counter with the air of someone who had already told the story twice. "He left not an hour after you walked away," Patel said. "Headed toward the jetty, looked upset." Hamish felt a twinge of worry. "Did he speak to anyone?" Patel shook his head. "Just stood there for a while. Then disappeared into the fog. No one saw him after." Luggs paced slowly, sniffing the wooden floor, as though catching a ghost of the stranger's presence. When Hamish reached the jetty, the mist had lifted slightly, revealing grey water lapping gently against the posts. The boards creaked beneath his feet. A few gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sounding thin. There were no signs of Andrew, no footprints distinct enough to read, only the smell of wet rope and the distant hum of a boat engine from across the loch. Hamish stood there, listening. The loch often kept its secrets until it chose to part with them. A faint breeze moved through the reeds, whispering across the water. As afternoon faded, Hamish returned to his cottage, unsettled. He fed Luggs and sat by the peat fire, letting its heat chase the damp from his bones. Yet unease settled beside him like an uninvited companion. He replayed Andrew's expression, something between dread and determination. Visitors rarely carried that mix without reason. The mist returned thicker than ever as dusk approached, cloaking the village anew. Lights flickered on in windows, soft yellow glows against the grey. The road glistened with rain, and the air smelled of wet stone. Just as Hamish prepared to close the curtains, a knock sounded on the door. It was Mrs. Carson from up the hill, her shawl speckled with rain. She looked anxious, though she tried to hide it under her usual stiff politeness. "Constable Macbeth," she said, "I hate to bother you, but someone said they saw a wee rowing boat drifting empty on the loch. No one in it, just drifting." Hamish felt the cold deepen. "Where?" he asked. "Near the far bend," she replied, going slow as though caught in the current. Luggs let out a low growl, turning toward the door. Hamish thanked her and stepped out into the gathering dark. The drizzle had eased, but the air was still thick, the mist curling around the road like slow-moving smoke. He walked toward the shore, Luggs trotting close. The loch was a vast grey sheet, the far bank barely visible. Hamish strained his eyes. There, hardly more than a shadow, a small boat drifted without purpose, its oars trailing lightly. No figure moved within it. The sight sat heavy on his heart. He knew, even before checking, that whatever answers Andrew sought in Lochdubh had now sunk deeper into the water and fog. He stood at the water's edge until his coat grew damp again, the cold biting through. Luggs pressed against his leg, steady, silent. Hamish exhaled, a long breath disappearing into the mist. "Aye, boy," he murmured. "Something's not right." The loch gave no reply, only the soft lap of water against stone. Tomorrow would bring questions, gossip, and the heavy tread of Strathbane interference. But for now, there was only the quiet dread curling through the village, like the evening fog, and the certainty that a stranger's arrival had disturbed more than just the air. The fog clung low over Lochdubh, thick enough to turn the shoreline into a blurred smear of grey against darker grey. Hamish Macbeth stepped out of his cottage, with Luggs trotting close, the dog's ears flicking in faint unease. The morning carried a cold that settled into the bones. No wind, only stillness, as though the entire village were listening for something it didn't wish to hear. Hamish had barely locked the door when he noticed Sandy McLean, one of the crofters, hurrying along the road. Sandy rarely hurried unless weather or livestock demanded it, and neither seemed responsible today. The man's face was pale beneath his wool cap, his mouth tight, as if holding back words that threatened to spill out too quickly. Lugs whined low, sensing the tension, before Hamish spoke. "Morning, Sandy," Hamish said calmly. "What's the bother?" Sandy glanced over his shoulder, as though the fog itself might overhear. "Down by the rocks," he said. "The black ones east of the jetty. There's a man there, dead, I think. I didn't touch him, just ran." His voice shook despite the crofter's natural stoicism. Hamish nodded, neither alarmed nor dismissive. Death came to the Highlands on quiet feet, and one learned to move with similar quiet. "Right," he said. "Show me." Sandy swallowed and started back the way he came, while Hamish followed with lugs, keeping unusually close to his side. The rocks emerged from the mist like crouched animals, slick with moisture, dark against the dull shimmer of the loch. Sandy stopped short, pointing with an unsteady hand. Hamish stepped forward alone, lugs at his heels. The body lay wedged between two outcroppings, half supported by the angles of stone. The man's face was pale, the kind of pale that spoke of hours in the cold rather than moments. Hamish recognised him at once. Andrew, the visitor who had asked for Priscilla only the day before. Lugs whined softly, pushing his nose forward, then hesitating, as though torn between curiosity and sorrow. Hamish crouched, careful not to disturb anything. There were no obvious wounds, no blood on the stones, no sign of a struggle. The man's coat was torn near the shoulder, however, and when Hamish traced the fabric with 2 fingers, he saw that an inside pocket hung empty, the stitching pulled. Something had been taken or lost. His mind registered the details quietly, filing them in the understated compartments where he kept useful things. His thoughts rarely shouted. They murmured their conclusions, like the loch lapping at stone. A burst of coarse laughter shattered the stillness. Blair had arrived. Inspector Blair clomped toward the scene, with Anderson in tow, the pair of them looking like 2 mismatched crows. "What have ye done this time, Macbeth?" Blair bellowed. "Couldn't keep the man alive for even one day?" Hamish didn't look up. He kept his voice even, as if speaking to a child in the middle of a tantrum. "I found him like this. Sandy here reported it." Blair snorted, dismissing both statements, with a wave of his hand. "You've trampled over all the evidence, no doubt." Anderson nodded vigorously beside him, lips pursed in habitual obedience. "There's no real evidence to trample," Hamish said mildly. "Drowned, most likely, or slipped." Blair's eyes glittered, hungry for incompetence. "We'll see about that. Davy wants full documentation, and you'll send reports hourly." Hamish said nothing. He knew better than to argue when Blair wanted a spectacle. The man thrived on imagined superiority. Instead, he stepped back to allow Blair's clumsy inspection. Lugs growled under his breath each time Blair moved too near the body, a sound Hamish did not discourage. No more than 5 minutes passed before a small crowd formed, drifting from the mist like cautious birds. Villagers gathered in loose clusters, whispering, their voices soft but sharp-edged. Mrs. Cumming leaned close to her neighbour, muttering about London scandals. Old Mr. Jameson declared that visitors always brought trouble. 2 English tourists speculated whether the dead man was an artist seeking inspiration. Hamish caught snippets here and there, enough to know the gossip machine had already spun faster than he could manage. He would need to speak carefully to guide it in useful directions rather than wild fantasy. Then a familiar voice cut through the murmurs. A quiet voice, controlled but strained. "Hamish." Priscilla Halburton-Smythe stood at the edge of the gathering, rain-spotted coat wrapped neatly around her. Her face was composed, though her eyes betrayed something fragile beneath the surface. Hamish felt a small twist in his chest but kept his face calm. "I'm sorry you had to come, sir," he said softly. Priscilla stepped closer, stopping short of the rocks. When she looked at the body, a faint tremor passed through her, quickly subdued. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "I knew him." Blair pounced instantly. "Aha! So you admit it." Hamish sent Blair a warning glance, but Blair was too delighted to notice. Priscilla ignored him entirely, as though he were no more than a bothersome insect. His name is Andrew Kincairn, she said, quietly. We were acquainted years ago. Her tone was clipped, controlled. Hamish read the unspoken words between the ones she offered. Whatever she and Andrew had shared, it had been complicated, and not something she would discuss with Blair looming. I'll need a statement, Blair sneered. Right now, in fact, Priscilla lifted her chin a fraction. You'll have it when appropriate, Inspector, not here. Her voice remained perfectly polite, yet Blair faltered with the sense of being dismissed. Anderson stared at her, as though witnessing treason. A gust of cold air shifted the fog, and the sound of distant thunder rolled over the hills. Hamish felt the change in weather, like a foretelling. A storm was heading toward Lochdubh, the kind that battered roofs and rattled weak window frames, cutting landlines and leaving roads slick. He needed the body moved before the worst of it arrived, but Blair insisted on a full sweep, ordering Anderson to poke uselessly at nearby stones while he barked instructions. Hamish stepped away from the immediate commotion, letting the villagers drift after him with hesitant questions. Mrs. Carmichael tugged his sleeve. Was it murder, Hamish? He looked like someone with secrets. I said so to Fiona last night. Hamish smiled faintly. Folk look all sorts of ways, Mrs. Carmichael. Secrets don't always kill. She sniffed at that, unconvinced, but satisfied with being acknowledged. Lugs nudged Hamish's leg, fur slightly damp from the fog. Hamish knelt to scratch behind the dog's ears. I know, he murmured. Something's off. He couldn't yet grasp what, but the torn pocket troubled him. It suggested purpose. Someone had been with Andrew after he vanished from the hotel doorway. Someone who didn't want something discovered. When Blair finally agreed to move the body, the storm clouds had crept low enough to cast the entire shoreline in brooding shadow. Hamish helped the villagers carry Andrew toward the waiting van, careful not to disturb the fabric more than necessary. Priscilla watched from a distance, face unreadable. Hamish approached her, keeping his voice low. You don't have to talk now. Go home for a bit. I'll come by later. She nodded gratefully, though she kept her posture poised. Thank you, Hamish. Her understatement carried a weight he felt but didn't voice. The first drops of rain began as Hamish walked back to his station, lugs pacing beside him. The drizzle thickened by the minute, turning the road into a reflective ribbon of wet stone. Inside the station, Hamish lit the peat fire, then set water to boil for tea. The room filled with the faint scent of smoke and damp wool steaming gently from his jumper. He tried calling Strathbane, but the line buzzed with interference. The storm was already meddling with the wires. He sat at his desk, staring at the half-filled report form Blair demanded. Paperwork irritated him, but his mind drifted anyway to Andrew. His exhausted face, the guarded tone, the missing item. Something had driven the man to the water's edge, but Hamish doubted it was simply despair. People sometimes came to Lochdubh seeking peace, but Andrew had carried a shadow with him, one darker than loneliness. Thunder cracked outside, shaking the window slightly. Lugs lifted his head, ears pricked. Hamish stood, walked to the window, and watched the rain streak down the glass. Somewhere beyond the hills, the storm pressed its weight against the village, tightening the hold of isolation that always accompanied bad weather. And now there was a dead man with ties to Priscilla, ties she did not want to describe. He exhaled a quiet sigh, the kind that carried years of understanding that life rarely offered simple answers. We'll dig it out, boy, he murmured to Lugs. Bit by bit, the dog settled again, satisfied by Hamish's steady voice. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the loch, revealing its dark, rippling surface. In that brief light, Hamish imagined the black stones and the body lying among them. The image sat heavy. Tomorrow would bring questions from villagers, demands from Blair, and pressure from Daviot. But tonight, the storm would claim the village, and silence would settle deeper than fog. Hamish closed the curtains, poured himself tea, and sat near the fire, the room glowing softly with orange light. Outside, rain lashed the windows. Inside, the warmth barely softened the melancholy that came whenever death touched the quiet rhythm of Lochdubh. He stroked Lugs's head. We've a long road ahead, my lad. The fire popped. The storm deepened. And somewhere beyond the darkened hills, the truth waited, patient and cold. Rain drifted down in thin, steady lines, tapping softly at the window of the Lochdubh police station. The grey morning felt heavier than usual, as though the clouds themselves were mourning. Hamish Macbeth stood at the kettle, waiting for it to boil, his jumper still smelling faintly of the peat smoke from last night's fire. Luggs lay near the desk, chin on paws, watching the door with the restless stillness of an animal who sensed unpleasant duties approaching. The storm had rolled through most of the night, rattling the tin roof and cutting the landline twice before coming back with a weak crackle. Strathbane had not yet called, but they would. They always did when trouble came near Priscilla Halburton-Smythe. The kettle clicked off, and Hamish poured hot water over the tea bag slowly, letting the steam blur his glasses. His thoughts moved in their usual quiet, understated way. Andrew Kincairn dead, washed up by the black rocks, and Priscilla knowing him from years ago, but speaking of it with the restraint of a woman who chose her truths carefully. Hamish didn't suspect her of anything wicked, but he sensed she was holding something back, and whatever that was, it sat between them now, like a polite stranger invited into the room. The door opened with a soft creak. Priscilla stepped in, damp from the walk, though she carried herself with her usual composed grace. She removed her gloves slowly, wringing out just enough rain to darken the wood floor. Luggs lifted his head, ears pricked, tail thumping once in hesitant greeting. Priscilla managed a faint smile before turning to Hamish. "Thank you for asking me," she said in that gentle, measured tone of hers. "I thought it best to come early." Hamish gestured toward the chair by the desk. "Have a seat." "Tea?" she nodded, smoothing her coat in that small, elegant way she had, never fussing, only refining. As he set her cup down, he noticed the slight tremble of her fingers, too controlled to be fear, more like the strain of old memory pulled forward unwillingly. "I'll need to ask you about Andrew," Hamish said quietly, "just to get the facts straight before Blair turns it into a carnival." Priscilla's eyebrows dipped in faint irritation at the mention of Blair, but her voice remained steady. "I expect nothing less from him." She inhaled, exhaled, then began. "Andrew Kincairn and I were at Edinburgh University at the same time. He was brilliant, restless, always trying to outrun some shadow behind him. Everyone liked him, though they pretended not to. He had charm when he wished to use it." Hamish listened, not interrupting. He watched her closely, the way she straightened her posture, the way her eyes drifted toward the rain, as though reading her memories in the streaks on the glass. Luggs rose and padded closer to her, sitting by her chair, sensing her unsettled calm. Priscilla rested a hand on his head, absently stroking the dog's thick fur. "We weren't involved," she said abruptly, as though preempting an unspoken question. "Not like that. He had his admirers, but there was something in him that never allowed closeness, and she paused, catching herself. "I was never very good at youthful whims." Hamish nodded. He felt no sting of jealousy, only the familiar, distant ache that always came when Priscilla spoke of her past. "Why come now?" he asked gently. "Did he give any reason?" She reached into her coat and withdrew a damp envelope, its edges softened by the rain, but the postmark still visible. "He wrote this," she said, handing it to Hamish. 3 weeks ago. He said he needed to speak to me about something important, a matter of old debts and older mistakes, he wrote. I told him not to come. She broke off, swallowing. I didn't want my parents bothered. My father has enough to worry about without ghosts from my student days knocking on the door. Hamish opened the letter carefully. It was short, vague, full of Andrew's looping script. A tone of regret threaded through it, but no clear explanation. Hamish folded it back into the envelope. Did he say he was in trouble? He asked. Priscilla hesitated. That hesitation told Hamish more than words. He never said it outright, but Andrew had a way of implying things, making it seem as though he was standing at the edge of some cliff only he could see. Rain thickened against the window, the steady tapping deepening into a drum of droplets rolling down the glass. Hamish leaned back slightly. He came looking for you, he said softly. But he didn't go to the estate. Priscilla's face tightened. No, he wouldn't. Not with my father there. Andrew and father never got on. How so? Hamish pressed gently. Priscilla stared into her tea, as though the answer floated somewhere beneath the surface. It's difficult to explain. Andrew thought highly of my mother, but regarding my father, she trailed off. He felt father judged him. And perhaps he did. Father always disliked men who asked questions they had no right to ask. Hamish absorbed that, tucking it away. And you told Andrew not to come? She nodded. Firmly. I sent him a polite but final reply. Her eyes flicked to the window again, to the blurred world beyond. He never did respect boundaries. Just then, the station door slammed open, banging against the wall hard enough to rattle the calendar. Blair marched in, damp coat flapping like an offended crow. Ah, there ye are, he barked. Thought I'd find you whispering away with your friend here. Anderson hovered behind him, dripping slightly and trying to look authoritative. Priscilla turned her head with the coolness of a woman long accustomed to men like Blair. Inspector, she said, her voice neither warm nor rude, just exquisitely controlled. Blair barreled past courtesy. I need answers, now. Your man Andrew shows up dead on our rocks, and you expect me to believe it's all coincidence? You were involved with him, Hamish stood up sharply. That's enough, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying weight. You'll speak with respect, Blair's mouth twisted. Respect? For someone hiding information? Anderson nodded behind him, eager to imitate indignation. Priscilla didn't flinch. She simply looked at Blair with a level gaze that made him blink. I have told Constable Macbeth what I can, she said. When I have more to offer, I will do so, but I will not be shouted at by you. Hamish stepped between them. Blair, take your theatrics outside before you make more of a fool of yourself. Blair sputtered, briefly thrown off balance by Priscilla's calm defiance, then jabbed a stubby finger at Hamish. Daviet wants you on the phone, and he wants every scrap of information. Every scrap, Macbeth. His tone made it clear he believed Hamish was already withholding something. I'll call him, Hamish said simply. Blair made a noise somewhere between a snort and a grunt and stormed out, Anderson scrambling after him. The door shut. Silence returned, heavy but welcome. Lugs exhaled loudly, almost theatrically, as though the entire scene offended his sensibilities. Priscilla shook her head faintly. Blair hasn't changed. No, Hamish said. And he won't. He sat again, softening his voice. Priscilla, is there anything else? Anything Andrew said before this happened? She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were clear but guarded. Only that he was coming north whether I wanted him to or not. That he had something I ought to know. Something he couldn't trust to a letter. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of her cup. I didn't think he'd actually come. Hamish watched her carefully. Priscilla's restraint was never emptiness. It was a shield. What lay behind it today, he wasn't sure, but he sensed it was larger than she admitted. A memory, perhaps, or a fear. Outside, villagers moved along the road, their shapes flickering like shadows behind the misted glass. Mrs. Carmichael's tartan umbrella bobbed past, accompanied by the unmistakable tilt of Mr. Jameson's cap. Gossip had begun. It would grow as naturally as moss in damp stone. You should go home, Hamish said softly, before the weather worsens. Priscilla rose slowly, smoothing her coat again, restoring herself with the small rituals of controlled elegance. You'll keep me informed? She asked. Aye, Hamish said. Of anything I can. She lingered a moment longer, her gaze searching his face with quiet gratitude. And something else, neither named. Thank you, Hamish. He nodded, though the words stayed with him longer than they should. When she left, Lugs moved to the window, watching her cross the puddled road toward the estate path. The rain had thickened again, pushing the village into a kind of muffled isolation. Hamish stood beside the dog, feeling the weight of everything unsaid settle in his chest. Andrew Kincairn had come north chasing something unfinished, and Priscilla, whether she liked it or not, was entangled in whatever that was. Hamish picked up the envelope again, studying the vague letter through the dim grey light. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the hills. The loch beyond vanished into fog once more, swallowing its secrets with practised ease. Something's stirring, boy, Hamish murmured to Lugs, and it's nae done with us yet. The dog leaned against him, warm and steady. Rain traced long streaks down the window, blurring the world beyond into shadow and water, an ending that felt more like a beginning. A thin frost clung to the village roofs when Hamish stepped out into the early light, the kind of brittle coating that made the world look suspended between seasons. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the air sharp and clean, though mist still hovered low along the loch, as if reluctant to leave entirely. Lugs trotted beside him, sniffing at the stiff blades of grass, ears twitching whenever a distant gull cried. Hamish drew his jacket closer. There was something uneasy in the quiet, something left behind by Andrew Kincairn's death. Even the sheep on the hillside seemed subdued, their usual bleats softened into the cold morning. Hamish began his usual rounds, with no hurry, letting the village open to him, as it always did, one door at a time, one cautious greeting after another. It was the way he solved everything. No demands, no force, just steady talk, the sort of conversation that revealed more in what was unsaid than spoken. Andrew had crossed paths with enough people in his too brief visit that the truth would weave itself together if Hamish followed the threads with a gentle hand. His first stop was the loch path, where he found an English couple, holiday-makers from Kent, according to their chatter, wrapped in matching waterproofs and studying the frost as though it were some exotic Highland creature. When they saw Hamish, they brightened in the way only tourists did, eager for a story to take home. "Oh, Constable, the woman said, stepping forward. "We meant to tell someone yesterday. That poor man. They said he died, didn't they?" Hamish nodded. "Aye. You saw him?" "Just briefly," the husband said. "He asked us the way to the Halburton-Smythe estate. Very polite, but, well, odd. He wanted to know if the estate overlooked the deeper part of the loch. Quite insistent on it." Hamish's brow lifted a fraction. "The deeper part." Yes, the wife chimed, as though he cared terribly about where the loch dropped off. "I thought perhaps he was writing something. He had that thoughtful look, thoughtful or troubled." Hamish thanked them with his usual quiet charm, allowing the couple to leave satisfied they'd contributed something meaningful. When they wandered off, chattering about midges and tea, he stood a moment longer, letting the information settle. Andrew asking about depths, about the estate, nothing straightforward about that. He continued into the village proper, frost cracking underfoot. Patel's shop was warm and smelling of spices, the windows fogged from the heater, struggling to battle the morning chill. Patel, standing behind the counter with a stack of invoices, looked up with the concerned expression he reserved for local tragedies. "You're wanting cigarettes?" he asked out of habit. "No," Hamish murmured. "But Andrew bought some yesterday, didn't he?" Patel nodded. "Aye. He looked distracted, kept glancing at the window, asked if the loch currents ever changed direction in storms. I told him they didn't change that much, but he didn't seem convinced." Hamish leaned lightly on the counter. "Did he say why he cared about the currents?" Patel shook his head. "No, but when he left he walked toward the jetty, not the hotel. I thought he'd lost something." Hamish thanked him, bought a tin of tea he didn't really need, and stepped back into the cold. Frost was already melting on the stones, thin rivulets forming along the road. Lugs walked ahead, nose close to the ground, occasionally glancing back to be sure Hamish was following. The hotel was his next stop. The maid, a shy girl named Nora, stood in the hallway, wringing a damp cloth between her hands. She led Hamish to the small office near the reception desk. "He came in here," she said quietly. "Used the telephone. I didn't mean to overhear, but the voice travels through the walls." "What did you hear?" Hamish asked gently. Nora hesitated. He was angry, very angry, whispering fast like he didn't want anyone to catch the words. Then he said, "I won't be threatened," and the phone slammed down. "When he came out, he nearly ran into me. He apologised, but he looked frightened." Hamish watched her face, the discomfort there. Nora was not one to exaggerate. "Did he say who he called?" "No, but he asked if anyone had left messages for him. There weren't any." Hamish nodded. "You've been helpful." Nora seemed relieved to be dismissed. Outside again, he paused in the crisp air. Andrew had asked about the estate, about the loch depths and currents. He'd argued on the phone, and he'd seemed frightened. All small threads, but they formed a pattern Hamish felt rather than fully understood. It was enough to know Andrew had stirred up more than a polite visit to old acquaintances. He headed toward the Kirk Hall, where a line of villagers were emerging after a morning meeting of some variety, knitting group or choir practice, or one of the endlessly rotating committees that kept Lochdubh's gossip thriving. Mrs. Struthers spotted him and waved him over with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to unveil a secret. "Hamish Macbeth, you'll want to hear this," she said breathlessly. "That visitor, the dead one, he upset poor Donal the boatman. Something fierce." Hamish raised a brow. Donal, a stout man with weathered hands and a temper softened only by whiskey, was rarely upset by anything except tourists mishandling his oars. "What happened?" Hamish asked. He asked Donal to row him across the loch, but only to certain points, and he wanted to know if anyone else ever hired him to visit the same places. Donal wouldn't say much, just muttered that the lad was prying into business that wasn't his. Hamish thanked her, though she looked disappointed he didn't stay to hear the rest of the gossip. Lugs followed him toward the jetty, where Donal often lingered, even when he wasn't ferrying anyone. The boatman was there, hunched against the cold, sipping from a flask he pretended was just tea. Hamish approached quietly. "I hear Andrew spoke with you." Donal grunted. "Folk talk too much." "That they do," Hamish agreed mildly. "So why don't you tell me instead?" Donal sighed, then gestured toward the water. He wanted to go out to where the loch dips deepest, said it mattered, asked if I'd taken anyone else there lately, as if the loch is some kind of confessional. "Did you take him?" "No." Didn't like the look in his eye, like he was chasing something he couldn't catch. Hamish let Donal's words settle. Then he nodded, thanked him, and walked on. By mid-afternoon, frost had fully melted, leaving the village damp and shining faintly under a thin, weak sun. Hamish made his way toward the croft, near the edge of the moor. The reclusive crofter, Ewan McNeill, eyed Hamish from his doorway with suspicion that seemed carved into his face. "You'll want something," Ewan said flatly. Hamish kept his tone easy. "Just a bit of talk, Ewan. You saw Andrew about?" Ewan hesitated a beat too long. "Aye, he came this way, wanted directions, asked if I knew old paths to the estate, said he needed a quiet route. I told him I wasn't a map." Hamish caught the defensive note and decided not to press harder. "Not yet." "Thanks," he said, letting silence do the rest. Lugs stared at Ewan long enough that the crofter shifted uncomfortably. The last person Hamish needed to see was the academic who had taken up a room at the hotel, a thin man named Dr. Fenwick, with spectacles that seemed too large for his face and an air of constant distraction. Hamish found him near the loch edge, scribbling in a notebook despite the cold. "Dr. Fenwick," Hamish said quietly. The man jumped, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Ah, constable. Terrible business about that fellow." "You spoke with him?" Hamish asked. "Only briefly. He was interested in clan markers, particularly an old stone near the Halburton-Smythe land. Wanted to know if it marked anything important." Fenwick gave a nervous laugh. "I told him clan history is rarely simple. People carry guilt for centuries." Hamish left the academic to his scribbling. He'd gathered enough. 5 people unsettled by Andrew: Priscilla, the hotel owner's son, the boatman, the crofter, and the academic. None seemed violent, but each carried shame, guilt, or secrets Andrew might have touched. Evening settled early, as it often did in the Highlands, the cold deepening again. Frost crept across windows as Hamish walked back toward his cottage, lugs pressing closer to his leg as though sensing the weight of the day. The loch reflected only a thin sliver of fading light. Hamish paused, looking across the still water. Andrew had come north asking old questions, stirring old feelings, and someone had feared him enough to steer him towards silence, whether by accident or by intention, yet unclear. Hamish breathed out slowly, watching the vapour drift into the cold air. "Folk fear strange things," he murmured to Lugs, "but fear leaves marks." The dog nudged his hand gently. A soft wind rose from the hills, carrying the scent of peat smoke and something darker, secrets settling into the quiet, waiting for him to find them. The moor stretched out before Hamish in muted sweeps of brown and purple, the heather dulled by the grey morning light. A thin veil of mist clung low to the ground, drifting over the uneven earth like smoke escaping from an unseen fire. The storm of the previous night had left pockets of water along the path, each one reflecting the dim sky in little trembling mirrors. Hamish walked slowly, hands deep in his pockets, while Lugs trotted ahead, pausing now and then to sniff at tufts of heather or tilt his head toward distant sounds only a dog could decipher. Hamish found his thoughts drifting to Andrew Kincairn in the quiet, unsettled rhythm of the morning. The moors always helped him think. The open space allowed his mind to move at its own pace, never rushed, never forced. Andrew's sudden arrival, his troubled manner, his quiet desperation, none of it settled neatly in Hamish's understanding of the man. And the way Priscilla had spoken of him, with her careful restraint and those fleeting shadows in her eyes, troubled Hamish more than he cared to admit. He felt the familiar tug of wanting to protect her from old ghosts she had never invited. Lugs suddenly halted, nose pressed to the ground, tail pointing straight out. Hamish slowed, watching the dog circle a small hollow between two mounds of heather. Something dark lay nestled inside, half hidden by the tangled stems. Hamish crouched, brushing the heather aside with gentle fingers. A small leather-bound notebook emerged, wet along the spine, its cover scuffed as though it had travelled some distance in a hurry. "Well now," Hamish murmured, "what have we here?" He lifted it carefully, feeling the dampened leather soften under his fingers. Lugs gave a low sound, not quite a growl, more an anxious curiosity. Hamish flipped the book open. The first pages were blank, but deeper inside, he found entries, short, tense, written in a quick hand, that pressed the ink hard into the paper. Andrew's handwriting. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the heather around him. Hamish turned a page. She never knew what they hid from her. He stared at the line a long moment, reading it twice, then a third time. The words sat heavily on the page, as though carved rather than written. He knew instinctively who the she referred to, Priscilla. And whatever had been hidden from her, Andrew believed it mattered enough to come all the way to Lochdubh in miserable weather, only to end up dead on the black rocks. Hamish flipped through more entries. Each page hinted at old disputes, unfinished business, scattered references to Priscilla's family, always careful, always incomplete, as though Andrew feared the wrong eyes would one day find the notebook. There were mentions of an inheritance row long past, of a betrayal he never named, and of a debt that lingered between him and someone he refused to write clearly about. And threaded through it all was a quiet desperation that unsettled Hamish more than any mention of quarrels. He closed the notebook gently, slipping it into his coat. Blair would twist every word, build some dramatic tale to suit his inflated sense of grandeur. Hamish would not allow that, not yet. He stood rubbing a hand over Lugs's head as the dog leaned against him, sensing the change in mood. "Come on, boy," Hamish said softly. "We'll see what else the moor's hiding." They walked on, the mist closing behind them like a curtain. The path narrowed near the old croft, where Ewan McNeill lived, a solitary man by choice and temperament. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, wavering column. As Hamish approached, Lugs stiffened again, nose lifting toward the bothy. Ewan stepped out just then, wiping his hands on a rag, expression as guarded as always. "You're early for visiting," Ewan said gruffly, though there was no hostility in his tone, just habitual wariness. Hamish nodded politely. "I was out walking, thought I'd ask you something since I'm near." Ewan crossed his arms. "Aye? And what's that?" "Andrew," Hamish answered. "You saw him, didn't you? Someone said you found his scarf near here." Ewan's eyes flicked away for the briefest moment, a tiny crack in his stony demeanour. "Aye," he muttered. "Found it caught on the fence there. Looked like it had snagged while someone was in a hurry. Gave it to Blair when he questioned me." Hamish watched him. Was Andrew in a hurry? Ewan hesitated again. He was unsettled, kept looking behind him, asked about old paths, secluded ones, wanted to know if they still led to the Halburton-Smythe land. I told him I didn't keep a map in my pocket. Hamish waited. Ewan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He seemed scared, Hamish. Not of the police, not of the villagers. Of something behind him, something he thought was coming. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of damp peat. Hamish absorbed the words quietly. "Andrew frightened. asking about hidden paths, searching for something about Priscilla's family. "You didn't see anyone else?" Hamish asked. "No," Ewan replied. "Just him. And he didn't stay long. Wanted to move before the weather turned." Hamish nodded. "Thanks. You've been helpful." Ewan grunted, embarrassed by the compliment, and retreated inside, closing the door with a soft thud that echoed faintly across the moor. Hamish and Luggs began the return journey to Lochdubh. The drizzle started slowly, a soft patter against his coat, then thickened into a steady fall, transforming the moor's colours into deeper shadows. The sky drew in close, darkening with the promise of another heavy spell. Luggs pressed more firmly to Hamish's side, as though urging him not to linger too long in the open. The path narrowed through a stretch of tall grass, its blades heavy with rain, bending under each droplet. Hamish walked carefully, thinking through everything he'd learned. Andrew asking about currents, depth, maps, paths, old markers, fear behind his eyes. And now, this notebook full of cryptic lines and dangerous implications. The moor seemed to respond to the weight of his thoughts, the drizzle becoming a curtain that sealed the world into a quiet, almost claustrophobic silence. Far in the distance, the loch glimmered faintly, the water moving with a darker rhythm under the shifting clouds. When they reached the outskirts of Lochdubh, the village felt hushed, as though holding its breath between rainfall and rumours. Mrs. Carmichael hurried across the road with a basket of washing that would never dry in this weather, muttering about storms and London scandals. The postmaster leaned against the doorway, pretending not to look curious, as Hamish passed. A few tourists huddled near the hotel porch, trying to decide whether the rain was worth braving for a morning walk. Hamish slipped past them quietly, heading to the station. Once inside, he shrugged off his wet coat and set it over the back of a chair. Luggs shook himself vigorously, spraying droplets across the wooden floor. Hamish didn't mind. The cottage and the station were always a bit damp anyway. It was simply the nature of life in Lochdubh. He placed the notebook on the desk, flipping it open to the line again. She never knew what they hid from her. Hamish ran a finger along the ink. The scrawl seemed almost desperate. Whoever Andrew meant, whatever was hidden, Priscilla was at the heart of it, and Hamish felt the weight of that knowledge pressing against his chest, quiet and heavy. He thought of her face the day before, the slight tremor she tried to hide, the walls she kept so carefully in place. Blair would not see the truth. He would twist everything into melodrama. Daviot would push for a quick conclusion. Only Hamish seemed capable of seeing the deeper wound beneath Andrew's frantic last days, the wound tied to Priscilla's past, her family, her pride. Hamish closed the notebook slowly, slipping it into the drawer of his desk where Blair would not find it easily. He stared at the rain-smeared window. The drizzle had thickened into something steady, rhythmic, as if the moors themselves wished to keep their secrets a little longer. Luggs padded to Hamish's side, resting his head against Hamish's knee with a soft, grounding weight. "Aye, boy," Hamish murmured. Whatever Andrew feared, it wasn't violence, it was truth. The rain drummed harder against the glass. Hamish reached for the kettle, filling it again for fresh tea. Outside, the world remained dim and grey, the loch hidden beneath a blanket of mist that refused to lift. Somewhere in that quiet gloom, answers waited, buried not in crime but in old shame and long-held secrets. And the diary in the drawer whispered silently that Priscilla's life had been shaped by something she had never been told. A pale, colourless dawn seeped into Lochdubh, washing the village in a watery light that did nothing to warm the air. The storm had battered the hills all night, leaving puddles pooled along the road like small defeated lochs of their own. Hamish Macbeth stood at his kitchen window, with a mug of tea cooling between his hands, his hair still tousled from sleep, and Luggs pressed against his leg for warmth. The kettle rattled faintly on the hob, steam curling up in lazy spirals. Hamish felt the familiar heaviness of a day that would bring trouble long before anyone knocked. The moors were quiet, the loch grey and flat, too quiet, too flat. Trouble from Strathbane carried its own atmosphere, like a stale smell drifting in with the morning damp. Luggs lifted his head and whined an instant before a fist pounded on the cottage door. Hamish sighed set down his mug and opened it. There stood Anderson, soggy, awkward, and wearing the expression of a man sent to deliver bad news he didn't quite understand. "Macbeth," he said, puffing himself up in a way that only made him look more like a nervous pigeon. "Daviot wants you in Strathbane immediately." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Aye? What for?" "Procedural concerns," Anderson recited, as though reading from a script he struggled to remember. "Chief says you might have mishandled the body on the rocks." Lugs growled softly. Hamish scratched behind the dog's ears. "Tell him I'll come when I'm ready." "No," Anderson said, his voice cracking on the word. "You're to come now. Blair insisted." Hamish's internal sigh was brief and dry. The prospect of spending a morning under fluorescent lights with Blair, crowing in the background, made his shoulders sag. But fighting the summons would bring more trouble. He nodded with reluctant resignation. "Fine," he said. "Give me a moment." He grabbed his coat, checked the drawer containing Andrew's notebook, still hidden, then ushered Lugs inside with instructions to behave, though he doubted the dog listened. Outside, the wind carried yesterday's rain, in thin, cold remnants. Anderson hurried toward the police car, slipping on the wet road, and Hamish followed at a pace that suggested he wasn't particularly invested in making good time. The drive to Strathbane was long and dreary. The washed-out roads forced Anderson to slow, grumbling as he tried to avoid deep ruts carved by the storm. Hamish stared out the window, watching the sodden fields blur past. The wet scent of mud and sheep drifted into the car, each time Anderson cracked the window to keep it from steaming up. Strathbane loomed ahead, grim, grey, and as cheerless as always. The station's fluorescent lights flickered faintly, creating an unpleasant humming that set Hamish's nerves on edge. Lugs would have hated it here. Hamish hated it enough for both of them. Blair was waiting in the hallway, like a triumphant fox who had found a hen wobbling on a broken leg. "Well, well," Blair crowed. "Look who's finally arrived. Macbeth, are you planning to botch every case you touch?" Anderson laughed weakly behind him, eager to echo Blair's disdain. Hamish kept his face blank, hands tucked into his pockets. "Morning, Inspector, long drive." Daviot's office door opened, revealing the chief superintendent's pinched face. He gestured sharply. "Macbeth, inside, now!" Hamish obeyed, schooling himself into meekness the moment the door shut behind him. Daviot paced in that nervous, jerky manner of his, constantly adjusting his tie, though it never sat straight. Blair positioned himself against the filing cabinet, arms folded, smirking like a child watching a scolding. "Macbeth," Daviot began, "this entire situation has become an embarrassment. A dead visitor in your village, questionable handling of the scene, and no usable updates. Do you expect the press to ignore this?" Hamish tilted his head. "Press? They don't usually care about drownings." Blair seized the moment. "Unless it's not a drowning. You may have fouled the evidence, Macbeth. If you'd kept people back..." Hamish let his shoulders slump a little, eyes lowered in the practiced manner he saved for these meetings. "Maybe I've done poorly, sir," he said softly, but it looked like an accident. The man slipped on the wet rocks. No blood, no struggle. Just a sad misstep. Daviot paused. Blair blinked. Anderson, who had slipped into the office unnoticed, blinked too. Hamish continued, keeping his tone mild, almost apologetic. "You know how the villagers are, curious folk. Hard to stop them gathering. Maybe it muddied things, but all signs point to an accident. The sooner we file it as one, the sooner we avoid scandal." Daviot's head snapped toward Blair. "Is that true? Did you check for signs of struggle?" Blair sputtered. "Well, the rocks. You see, the waves." Hamish kept his expression mild. He watched the confusion blossom on Blair's face like frost spreading on glass. It was almost an art, letting Blair hang himself with his own bluster. Daviot frowned at Blair, then turned back to Hamish, a little colour returning to his cheeks. "You're suggesting we settle this quickly?" "Aye," Hamish said gently. "Wouldn't want reporters sniffing around. Better to mark it accidental, keep things tidy. Less paperwork too." The magic words, "less paperwork," softened Daviot immediately. "Well," Daviot said, clearing his throat, "perhaps you're right. If evidence of foul play is lacking, and if Blair's initial observations," he added with thinly veiled disappointment, "were inconclusive, we may handle this discreetly." Blair opened his mouth to protest. Daviot silenced him with a sharp glare. Hamish bowed his head slightly, humble as a monk. "Thank you, sir." "You may return to Lochdubh," Daviot said briskly, "but keep me updated. And Macbeth, no more publicity risks." "Of course," Hamish replied. As he left the office, Blair lunged after him in the hallway. "You sneaky," Blair began, but Daviot shouted from behind the door. "Blair, in here, now!" Blair's face crumpled. Anderson watched Hamish leave with a mixture of confusion and petty resentment, clearly unsure how the interrogation had ended without Hamish in disgrace. Hamish gave him a mild smile. "Anderson, mind yourself, roads are slippery." Anderson flushed, torn between wanting to report Hamish and wanting Blair's approval. Hamish didn't wait for a reply. He slipped out the door and into the cold air like a man escaping a stuffy room. The drive back was slow. Rain had returned as a thin, irritating drizzle, peppering the windscreen like midges in summer. The hills loomed dark, soaked and heavy. Hamish kept the heater low, letting the steady hum fill the quiet. He felt Lugs's absence again, felt it in the hollow way the passenger seat sat empty. When he finally reached the cottage, Lugs bounded out with a relieved bark, circling Hamish and pushing his cold nose against Hamish's hand. Hamish bent and scratched behind the dog's ears, letting himself smile in a way he never did in Strathbane. "Miss me, boy?" he murmured. Lugs responded with another insistent nudge. Inside, Hamish stoked the peat fire back to life, the flames catching slowly, sending woody warmth into the room. The cottage smelled of damp wool and yesterday's tea. He changed into a dry jumper, boiled water, and settled at the table with a fresh cup. Only then did he pull Andrew Kincairn's notebook from his coat. The diary opened easily this time, the pages still curled from their time in the heather. Hamish read the entries again, slower, tracing the edges of Andrew's thoughts. Bitterness soaked through nearly every line involving Priscilla's father. Tidy anger, controlled but old. Something about business dealings years ago, something Andrew believed had never been resolved. Hamish turned to the margin, where a small symbol had been drawn again and again, a curved stone beside water, a marker, a place. He frowned. The symbol tugged at his memory, but faintly, like a dream that slips away when one tries to grab hold. Lugs rested his head on Hamish's knee, sensing the shift in mood. "Aye," Hamish whispered. "There's something in all this that wasn't finished. Not back then and not now." Outside, the drizzle thickened, tapping softly at the window. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the notebook and the symbol that would not leave Hamish's thoughts. Something old had resurfaced, something hidden, and it waited for him still. Dusk settled over Lochdubh in a slow, creeping hush, softening the colours of the village until cottages and hillsides blended into muted shapes. A thin veil of mist clung low across the fields, moving lazily as though reluctant to rise. The air carried the scent of damp stone and distant peat smoke, while the first faint lantern lights flickered from windows along the road. Hamish Macbeth walked steadily toward the Halburton-Smythe estate, his long stride unhurried, Lugs pacing at heel with an alertness that betrayed the dog's unease. The storm had eased earlier that afternoon, leaving the ground slick and the sky heavy with leftover gloom. It was the kind of evening where the world seemed to fold into itself, holding old secrets close. Hamish slipped through the estate's open iron gate, taking the gravel path up toward the grand white house that looked out over the loch. Its impressive front remained as imposing as ever, though the surrounding trees, shaken by the storm, appeared ruffled and uneasy. Lugs stopped twice to sniff the air, his ears twitching. Hamish felt a faint echo of that same tension, though he forced himself into his usual calm. The Colonel disliked any display that suggested emotional disturbance. A housemaid opened the front door as Hamish approached, nodding politely. "Good evening, Constable." "Evening," Hamish murmured. "Is the Colonel about?" "In his study. I'll tell him you're here." The study was a room Hamish knew well. Tall shelves lined with old books, a whiskey cabinet kept closed except for special occasions, and a heavy desk that dominated the space. Colonel Halburton-Smythe stood behind that desk now, ramrod straight, despite his years. His expression tightened when he saw Hamish. "Macbeth," the colonel said, voice clipped. "This isn't a social call, I imagine." "No," Hamish replied quietly. "I wanted to ask about Andrew Kincairn." At the name, the colonel's face froze. For a moment he looked as though he were bracing himself against an unexpected blow. He turned away, adjusting a stack of papers that clearly required no adjusting. "Unfortunate business," he muttered, "but the man brought trouble wherever he roamed." Hamish let the silence linger until the colonel finally met his eye again. "Did you know he came north to see Priscilla?" "I was informed," the colonel said stiffly. "My daughter mentioned it briefly. She hardly seemed concerned." Hamish doubted that. Priscilla rarely let concern show. He stepped closer, lugs sitting quietly at his heel, gaze following every movement. "What was your history with him?" Hamish asked. The colonel's jaw tightened. History? A dramatic word for a man who fancied himself an investigative genius. He was nothing but a meddler. Hamish tilted his head. "He thought you'd wronged someone, or been wronged. Something about business dealings?" The colonel stiffened even more. His hand brushed the edge of the desk, fingers curling faintly, as though gripping something invisible. "That is none of your affair." Hamish kept his voice soft, coaxing. Sometimes the past helps make sense of the present. The colonel gave a brittle laugh. "You sound like a minister." He sighed and walked toward the window, staring out at the dimming gardens. "Very well, if you insist on digging." Hamish waited, sensing he was on the edge of something the colonel had held tightly for years. "Years ago," the colonel began, voice low, "I entered into a business venture that went poorly. No crime, no scandal, only embarrassment. A foolish investment with foolish friends. I recovered. Most never knew, but Andrew found out." "How?" Hamish asked. "He was clever," the colonel admitted grudgingly. "Clever and curious. He pieced together whispers, old articles, small remarks never meant to matter. Then he confronted me, claimed I had misled people, said I owed others an apology. The colonel clenched his teeth. "He enjoyed exposing things." Hamish watched him carefully. Pride was a fragile thing in men like the colonel. "Did you ever resolve it?" Hamish asked. "No," the colonel snapped, "because it required engaging with him, and I refused. The matter was petty, ancient, and unworthy of further attention." Hamish noted the slight tremor in the colonel's hand. There was more beneath the surface. Shame, perhaps, not guilt. Shame lived longer. At that moment a soft noise caught Hamish's attention, a faint rustle from the hallway. Priscilla stepped into the room, her calm face unusually pale in the dim light. "Father," she said quietly, "you told me none of this." The colonel turned sharply. "Priscilla, this is old history." "That isn't the point," she said with cool restraint. "You kept it from me." Hamish watched the unspoken tension between them settle like dust in a still room. Priscilla's voice remained steady, but her eyes betrayed a wound Hamish recognised. The hurt of discovering one's life had been shaped by hidden truths. "I didn't want you troubled," the colonel said, softer now. "By what? That you once made a mistake?" Priscilla's tone was controlled, but her posture, hands clasped too tightly, revealed more. "Andrew wrote to me. I couldn't understand what he wanted. And all the while, you never told me the truth." "You exaggerate," the colonel said weakly. "It was nothing." "Andrew didn't think so," Priscilla replied. "And now he's dead." Silence filled the room again. A long, heavy silence. Hamish cleared his throat gently. "Priscilla, ye dinna need to stay if it's—" "No," she replied, gathering herself. "I'm fine." But Hamish saw the tiny tremor at the edge of her composure. "I only meant to ask," he said softly, "if Andrew ever tried to use the information against you. Blackmail, perhaps." The colonel nodded sharply. "No, he wasn't a blackmailer. He was self-righteous. That was all." His tone, though curt, held an odd hint of reluctant respect. Priscilla looked to Hamish. "Did Andrew write anything about this?" Hamish hesitated a fraction, thinking of the diary hidden in his desk. "Nothing clear," he said. "Fragments, maybe." Priscilla's shoulders eased slightly, though she glanced away, hiding uncertainty. Hamish sensed the conversation nearing its end. Too much had been stirred already. He offered a polite nod to both. "I'll leave you to your evening." As he stepped out into the hallway, the muted light from the windows cast a faint glow along the polished floors. The house felt older in that moment, as though the shadows carried memories best left untouched. Outside, the air was colder than before. Light fog curled across the estate grounds, moving like pale ribbons through the grass. Lugs walked ahead, pausing often to look back, as though checking Hamish's thoughts remained with him. Hamish descended the steps and followed the gravel path toward the gate. Evening had deepened, and lanterns along the estate cast wobbly circles of amber light. The loch below reflected those lights in long broken streaks, as though the water itself couldn't hold steady beneath the weight of the day. As they reached the outer boundary, Lugs suddenly stopped, body rigid, ears forward. A faint snapping sound came from the cluster of birch trees near the fence, too controlled to be an animal blundering about, too cautious to be a villager out for a stroll. Hamish froze, watching the trees closely. Mist swirled between the branches, making it difficult to see clearly. Then he spotted movement, the flick of a coat hem, the quick, furtive retreat of a figure slipping deeper into the shadows. Hamish stepped forward. "Who's there?" Only the faint rustle of leaves answered him, but Lugs growled, low and certain. Hamish approached cautiously until he recognised a familiar shape half hidden behind the trees, the academic visitor, Dr. Fenwick. His notebook was clutched awkwardly in one hand, his glasses fogged. "Dr. Fenwick," Hamish called, tone steady. "You spying on the family now?" The academic startled so violently he nearly lost his footing. "Constable, I wasn't spying, merely observing. History often lies in behaviour." "Aye?" Hamish replied, unimpressed. Fenwick flushed. "Just taking notes on old clan routes and markers near the estate. I didn't realise anyone was outside." Hamish didn't believe him entirely. "It's late for note-taking," he said, mildly. "Folk might think you've something to hide." Fenwick sputtered, defensive. "I assure you I don't. I'm only interested in academic research." Hamish nodded in a way that conveyed neither agreement nor trust. "Be careful. This land holds more than old stones." Fenwick bobbed his head and retreated quickly toward the road. Hamish stood a moment longer in the growing fog. Lugs pressed closer, still uneasy. The surrounding trees creaked faintly, shifting in the cold breeze. Somewhere across the loch, a lantern flickered in a fisherman's hut. Hamish exhaled slowly. The Colonel's resentment, Priscilla's shock, Andrew's old accusations, and now a lurking academic with too much interest. The threads pulled tighter with every step of this case. He turned back toward the village, the mist closing behind him, like a curtain. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "There's more here than anyone wants to say." Lugs trotted at his side, ears still swivelling toward the trees. The night deepened around them, heavy and waiting. The morning arrived thin and colourless, the loch lying under a washed-out sky like a great sheet of pewter. Mist curled along the surface in pale ribbons, drifting with slow indifference toward the jetties. Hamish Macbeth walked the shoreline with Lugs trotting at heel, the dog stopping now and then to sniff at clumps of wet reeds. A faint wind moved across the water, carrying the sharp scent of kelp and cold stone. It was the kind of Highland morning that felt too quiet, as if sound itself had decided not to bother. Hamish had not slept well. Andrew Kincairn's diary lay heavy in his mind, its cryptic entries circling back to Priscilla and the curved stone symbol he couldn't quite place. The man had come north with secrets pressing on him from all sides, and Hamish felt, more than reasoned, that someone had tried to shape the story of his death before Hamish even knew what tale he was meant to uncover. Lugs suddenly stiffened, ears pricked. Hamish followed the dog's gaze and saw a small figure waving frantically from the harbour. It was Alec McRae, one of the part-time fishers, cap askew and face tight with urgency. Hamish lengthened his stride. "What's the bother, Alec?" Alec pointed down to the moored rowboats, with the air of someone who had stumbled onto something he wished he hadn't. "Found something odd," he said breathlessly. "In that wee white boat there, the same one Mrs. Carson saw drifting empty last night. I towed it back in before the storm worsened. Thought you should see." Hamish descended the creaking wooden steps to the jetty. The planks groaned beneath his weight, still damp from the night's drizzle. Alec gestured toward the middle boat. Hamish peered inside. A satchel, brown leather, water-spotted, lay tucked neatly beneath the central bench. Hamish felt his stomach tighten. Andrew's bag? Aye, Alex said. Least looks like what folk described. Hamish stepped into the boat with careful balance. Lugs whined from the jetty, unwilling to trust the shifting wood. Hamish crouched, lifting the satchel slowly. It felt light, too light. He unbuckled it. Inside lay a folded map of the loch and surrounding hills, a fountain pen with tarnished silver trim, and a pair of wool gloves, damp but neatly tucked together. Nothing incriminating, nothing dramatic, nothing that explained why Andrew had come north with shadows in his eyes. Behind him, Alex shifted nervously. I didn't touch anything. Just saw it under the seat when I was checking the oars. Hamish nodded. You did right. But something felt wrong. The bag was dry on top, though the rest of the boat was slick from both rain and lake spray. Someone had placed it here recently, deliberately. Alec frowned, voice dropping. You think he left it? Hamish's tone stayed mild. I think it's early to say. Before Alec could ask more, the heavy clomp of boots shattered the quiet. Blair appeared at the top of the jetty steps, Anderson panting behind him. Even from a distance, Blair's smugness preceded him, like fog. Aha! He crowed, as though unveiling a body rather than a satchel. So that's where the wee coward left his things. Staged his own drama, did he? Wanted attention, no doubt. Anderson nodded enthusiastically, nearly slipping on the wet planks. Hamish held Blair's gaze without blinking. It's too neat, sir, Blair scoffed. Macbeth, everything's too neat when it doesn't suit you. The man wandered about stirring trouble, then takes his own life for theatrics. It's obvious. Hamish kept his expression mild, though a faint irritation stirred beneath it. Blair knew nothing of Andrew's eyes the night he arrived, nothing of the fear described by those he'd met. But Blair wasn't interested in nuance. He was interested in pinning blame quickly, preferably on Hamish's supposed incompetence. Daviet will want a report, Blair said gleefully, and I'll make sure he knows you missed this. Hamish ignored the bait, focusing instead on the map. He lifted it from the bag, unfolding it carefully. Andrew had circled several spots along the loch's shoreline, not the obvious places, not the tourist paths, but the tucked-away bends, known mostly to crofters and fishers. In pencil, near one curved inlet, Andrew had drawn a small mark, a stone beside water, the same symbol from the diary. Hamish's pulse tightened slightly. Blair jabbed a stubby finger at the map. See? He planned it out, wandering like a lost sheep, probably meant to scare someone. Pathetic. Hamish folded the map again, or someone took it from him and planted it. Blair snorted. Macbeth, you'll say anything to keep this case open. Hamish slipped the items back into the satchel. Sometimes the obvious answer hides what matters. Blair scowled. Your job is to follow orders, not philosophy. With that, he spun around, coat flapping, and stomped back up the jetty. Anderson hurried after him, glancing nervously at Hamish, as though unsure whom to obey. Alec exhaled once the men were gone. He's a terror, that one. Thinks everything's solved before hearing a sentence of sense. Hamish gave a faint, humorless smile. Aye, that's Blair for you. He stepped back onto the jetty, lugs pressed against his leg, nose pointed toward the moors beyond the crofts. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. You smell something? Lugs stared toward the distant hills, tail stiff. Alex squinted in the same direction. Wasn't the crofter Ewan McNeill the one saying Andrew passed by his land? Maybe the dog knows something. Hamish nodded. Maybe. After thanking Alec, he walked away from the harbour, lugs leading with purposeful steps. Rain began again, thin, persistent, the sort that soaked a man slowly, without announcing itself. The ground squelched underfoot, the scent of wet grass rising in little bursts. The road toward the crofts wound between low stone walls and patches of heather. Sheep huddled under the lee of a hill, steam rising faintly from their wool in the damp air. Hamish walked steadily, letting his thoughts move where they wished. Andrew's map, the diary, the stone symbol, someone planting the satchel, someone afraid of what Andrew carried or might reveal. When he reached Ewan McNeill's croft, smoke curled from the chimney, though the windows were dark. Lugs paused at the gate, nose twitching. Hamish pushed it open and walked toward the bothy door. Ewan opened it before Hamish could knock. His eyes darted quickly, left, right behind Hamish, as though checking the world for witnesses. "You're back," he muttered. "Thought you'd finished pestering me yesterday." Hamish kept his voice calm. "Alec found Andrew's satchel in a boat under a seat." "I heard," Ewan crossed his arms. "Folk talk." "Aye, but the bag was dry on top. Someone put it there after the rain." Ewan stiffened just slightly. Hamish noticed. "You said Andrew passed by your land, asked about paths. Did he leave anything behind? Drop anything?" "No." Too quick, too sharp. Lugs growled softly. Hamish gave the man a gentle look. "Ewan, sometimes holding back makes things worse." Ewan's jaw clenched. His hands twitched at his sides. He was frightened, aye. Asked if anyone else used the old footpath to the estate. Asked if anyone followed him. But that's all. Hamish nodded. "That path's no secret. But the map shows he circled the inlet behind your north field." Ewan's eyes darted again. "Old fishing spot. Nothing more." Hamish didn't press. He had learned long ago that crofters, like wild creatures, revealed more when not cornered. He tipped his head politely and stepped back. As he walked away, Lugs cast one last suspicious glance toward the croft. Rain thickened. The sky hung low. The hills blurred into smudges. Hamish made his way toward the boatman again, Donal, who was mending nets under the shelter of a lean-to behind the hotel. His hands moved with quick, agitated motions, and he avoided Hamish's gaze. "Donal," Hamish said evenly. "We need to talk." Donal grumbled. "Not this again. You told Mrs. Struthers you never took Andrew anywhere, but Andrew marked your inlet on his map." Donal's fingers stilled. Rain dripped steadily from the roof above them. "I didn't take him," Donal muttered. "Just talked, briefly." "What about?" Donal swallowed. "He asked if the deep water there is safe. Said he'd heard tales about old clan stones sunk near the edge. Rubbish, I told him. But he was interested." "Aye." Hamish studied him. Donal fidgeted with the net, avoiding eye contact. "Did you see him again?" "No," Donal said too quickly. "Never." Hamish let the silence stretch. Donal's shoulders tightened. Finally, Donal looked up. "Fine. He came back later. Wanted me to take him out. I refused. Said the weather was turning. That's all." Hamish felt the shift. The truth Donal hadn't meant to share. "And the satchel?" Donal's expression flickered. "Not mine to say." Hamish stepped closer, voice soft. "Someone planted it, trying to steer us wrong." Donal shut his eyes briefly. "Aye, but I didn't do it." Hamish believed him. The man was nervous, not deceptive. When Hamish left the lean-to, the drizzle had turned to cold, persistent rain. He walked slowly toward home, Lugs keeping close. The loch looked darker now, rippling under the uncertain sky, its surface catching faint reflections of dim cottage windows. This satchel, this tidy collection of harmless objects, had been meant to end the trail, meant to convince Strathbane and Blair that Andrew's death held no more mystery. But Andrew's map, the circled inlet, the curved stone symbol, the fear lingering in the crofter's voice, Donal's nervous denial, the planted bag itself, all of it pointed away from easy answers. Hamish paused at the bend in the road, staring out at the loch. Rain pattered softly on his shoulders. Lugs pressed into his leg. "Folk leave messy trails, boy," Hamish murmured, "and Blair's daft enough to fall for it." Lugs gave a low, unhappy whine. Hamish resumed walking, the rain drumming a gentle rhythm on his coat as the village dimmed into evening. The red herring floated on the water behind him, but the truth, quiet, stubborn and patient, waited somewhere beyond the mist. The last light of evening lingered reluctantly over Lochdubh, fading in soft layers of grey and blue. The loch lay still, its surface broken only by the faintest shiver of wind. Low clouds pressed down on the hills, blurring their edges until the landscape seemed half dreaming. Hamish Macbeth walked the shore path with his collar turned up and his hands tucked deep into his pockets. The air held the cold bite that came before a Highland wind turned troublesome, though the night had not yet fully decided what it meant to be. Lugs trotted ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff the damp grass. The dog's ears flicked constantly, as though catching sounds too subtle for Hamish to notice. The scent of peat fires drifted from a few cottages, clinging to the air with homely insistence. Hamish breathed it in, letting the familiar smell settle him. The day had been long, full of whispered confessions and half-truths. A quiet walk suited him fine, but Lugg stopped suddenly, rigid, tail straight, nose pointed back along the path. Hamish paused. "What is it now, boy?" The dog's low growl vibrated through the stillness. Hamish listened. At first he heard only the water lapping softly against the rocks. Then faint but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Someone following. Not close enough to threaten, but not distant enough to ignore. He didn't turn, didn't quicken his pace. He simply kept walking, letting his posture remain loose, his stride easy. A man unused to danger might whirl around. Hamish knew better. Folk talked more freely when they thought no confrontation awaited. Luggs glanced up anxiously. Hamish gave a quiet, steady lad. A few minutes later, the footsteps grew faster, unsteady, hurried, perhaps even desperate. Hamish sensed the figure closing in. At last he slowed and stopped beside a cluster of bent willow trees that leaned toward the loch like old men listening. The footsteps faltered behind him before stopping altogether. Hamish turned calmly. Evening. A young man stood breathless in the path, chest heaving, face pale in the dimness. It was Gavin McIver, the hotel owner's son, nervous, polite, eager to please, and far too easily flustered. He wrung his hands, as though squeezing water from them. "Constable, Hamish, please, Gavin," Gavin gasped. Hamish stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Easy now. Catch your breath." Gavin shook his head sharply. I need to tell you something. Just don't put it in a report yet." Luggs sniffed his boots, and then backed up, sensing the lad's panic. Hamish led him toward a flat rock beside the path, where the loch glimmered faintly under the last shreds of daylight. "Sit. Start where you like." Gavin obeyed, shoulders slumped. "It's about Andrew Kincairn." Hamish felt the shift, calm but attentive. "Aye?" Gavin swallowed. "You know he came by the hotel. You know he asked questions." "Aye. He wasn't asking about Priscilla that time. He was asking about me." Hamish kept his tone mild. "Why would he do that?" Gavin rubbed his face. "Because he found out about the accounts." His voice cracked. "I didn't mean to. I only borrowed a wee bit at first. My dad never checks the books proper. I meant to put it back, I swear it. But then things snowballed and I couldn't stop." Hamish said nothing, letting the confession unfold at its own pace. "Andrew spotted the numbers," Gavin continued, shaking. "He said I needed to confess before someone else found out. Said I'd ruin the hotel's reputation. He said I'd ruin my family." Hamish studied the lad's trembling hands. "Did ye argue?" "Yes," Gavin whispered. "I told him he didn't know anything about it. I told him to mind his own business. He said he would, if I fixed things." Gavin looked up suddenly, eyes shining with fear. "But I didn't hurt him, Hamish. I didn't touch him. I swear on my mother's grave. I was only scared he'd tell my dad." Hamish nodded gently. "Gavin, I believe you." The relief was immediate, almost painful. Gavin's shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, breaking breath. Before Hamish could ask his next question, the night shattered with the heavy tramp of boots and the unmistakable growl of a man who mistook suspicion for intelligence. Blair burst onto the path, Anderson scrambling behind him like a nervous duckling. "Well, well," Blair barked, jabbing a finger at Gavin. "What have we here? A cosy wee conspiracy, you two having a secret meeting about your crimes?" Gavin flinched as though struck. Hamish stepped smoothly between them. "He was just talking, sir," Blair sneered. "Talking, was he? Looked more like guilty confession to me." He shoved his face closer to Gavin's. "What were ye telling Macbeth, eh? You drown that man, you steal his bag, maybe you two cooked this up together." Gavin let out a small, terrified sound. Hamish sighed inwardly. Blair had a gift for making the innocent look guilty, simply by existing near him. "Sir," Hamish said quietly, "let's not frighten the lad. He's done nothing violent." "How would you know?" Blair demanded. "You trust everyone. You'd trust a wolf if it wagged its tail." Hamish kept his tone patient, almost gentle. "If you want a real report, I'll give you one tomorrow. In written form, neat, with dates." Blair blinked, confused, irritated, and briefly off balance. "Written?" "Aye." Hamish nodded. If you shout at the boy now, you'll get scraps. If you want something tidy for Daviet, I'll have it on your desk by noon. Blair hesitated. Paperwork, proper paperwork, was his weakness. He liked ordering it, not doing it. And if Hamish handled the writing, Blair could claim credit later without lifting a finger. Fine, Blair snapped, but I'll be expecting a full account. No excuses. You'll have it, Hamish said with calm certainty. Satisfied with his imaginary victory, Blair turned sharply, nearly slipping on the wet path. Anderson hurried after him, stealing a glance at Hamish that tried to look authoritative but merely looked worried. Blair's footsteps faded. Silence returned, wide, delicate, and broken only by the soft ripple of water along the stones. Gavin gasped out a breath. Hamish, thank you. I thought he'd drag me to Strathbane. Hamish sat again beside him. You've done wrong, aye, but no murder. Andrew upset folk by holding up a mirror. That's not the same as someone wanting him dead. Gavin nodded shakily. I'll fix the accounts. I will. That's between you and your conscience, Hamish said softly. But keep your nose clean. Blair won't hesitate to blame ye if he can. Gavin wiped his face and managed a bleak smile. I'm sorry for the trouble. Go on home, Hamish murmured. Get some rest. Gavin left with quick, uncertain steps, disappearing into the growing dusk. Hamish remained seated, Lugs resting his chin on Hamish's knee. The dog let out a low, uneasy whine. Hamish scratched behind his ears, eyes drifting toward the darkening horizon. Andrew had stirred guilt in many. Priscilla, her father, the crofter, the boatman, now Gavin. Yet guilt was not violence, shame was not malice, and fear was not motive. The pattern forming before Hamish felt emotional, tangled in pride and hidden truths, not hatred. A gust of wind swept suddenly down the loch, ruffling Hamish's hair and sending ripples across the dark water. The air shifted. The peacefulness of the evening tightened subtly, as though the world itself were drawing breath. Lugs lifted his head, ears pricking again. Hamish felt the gentle danger in the air, not overt, not dramatic, but present, watching, waiting. Someone wanted the truth obscured. Someone wanted the wrong people to carry blame. Hamish rose, brushing off his trousers. The path home glimmered under the weak light of the rising moon, damp and uncertain. Come on, boy, he whispered. There's a storm coming yet. Lugs walked at his side, close and protective. The loch whispered behind them, its surface shifting under the restless wind. Dawn crept over Lochdubh in thin, reluctant strokes of grey, the kind of light that seemed unsure whether it wished to brighten or resign itself to another day of silence. The mist clung low above the water, thickening and thinning in lazy drifts, like pale breath on a cold mirror. Hamish Macbeth walked the path along the shore, with Lugs close at his heel, the dog's movements sharp and alert. The night wind had left broken reeds, scattered near the water's edge, their pale stalks bent as though something, or someone, had passed through recently. The diary rested in Hamish's coat pocket, its weight strangely comforting. He had stared at the curved stone symbol again and again the night before, the pencil shape almost mocking in its simplicity. A small arched stone beside water. The marker had stirred a memory he couldn't place until morning brought clarity. An old clan boundary stone, swallowed by reeds on the Halburton-Smythe estate, half forgotten, half dissolved into the landscape. As a boy he had passed it on long rambles, the sort of ancient thing people stopped noticing even while walking straight past it. Lugs stopped abruptly now, nose pointed toward the estate shoreline. Hamish felt the faint pull of intuition, the same quiet tug that guided him through most of his cases. He followed the dog down a narrow slope where the loch whispered against the mud. The stone emerged gradually through the fog, squat, curved and mottled with age, leaning slightly toward the water as though tired of its own history. Hamish crouched beside it. The chill from the damp earth crept through his trousers, but he ignored it, brushing reeds aside with careful fingers. Lugs snuffled with focused intensity, tail swishing once in restrained excitement. At the base of the stone, partly hidden by roots, Hamish saw a dark patch of disturbed soil. He pressed gently. The ground gave way. Hamish dug slowly with his hands until his fingers struck something metallic. A rusted box, its edges eaten thin by time, surfaced through mud and roots. He eased it free, wiping it against his coat sleeve. The lid resisted, then creaked open with a miserable groan. Inside lay letters, dozens, folded tight, bound together with a decaying ribbon. Their edges were brown from damp, their ink faded but legible enough. Hamish's breath escaped in a quiet exhale. Here lay the truth Andrew had chased across Scotland. Records of the Colonel's long-ago dealings, letters from partners, heated exchanges, broken promises, and finally, Andrew's own correspondence from years before. The last letter on top held Andrew's tight script. She deserved to know the truth. They hid it not from shame alone, but from fear of what she would become, with full understanding. Hamish read it twice, a soft ache rising beneath his ribs. Priscilla, so restrained, so composed, carried more unspoken history than anyone in Lochdubh guessed. Footsteps on the path made him stand. Lugs stiffened but didn't growl, instead padding forward as Priscilla Halburton-Smythe emerged through the thinning mist. Her coat was buttoned high, her blonde hair pinned neatly, despite the wind tugging insistently at it. She looked as if she had followed the morning light itself. "Hamish," she said quietly, "I thought I might find you here." He held her gaze, reading the subdued tension in her expression. Not surprise, acceptance, something already known but only now confirmed. "You knew about the stone?" Hamish asked. "I suspected," she replied, stepping closer. "Andrew once mentioned old markers, something about how history hides itself in plain sight." Her eyes lowered to the metal box in Hamish's hands. For a moment she said nothing, but her breath caught faintly. When she finally spoke, the words were nearly a whisper. "So it was real." "Aye," Hamish said gently. "Your father's dealings, Andrew's involvement, it's all here." Priscilla drew in a slow breath, steadying herself. "He wasn't trying to hurt me then." "No," Hamish said softly. "He came to warn you. Someone else was using the scandal to stir trouble." Her composure wavered, just slightly, just enough for Hamish to see the sorrow behind it. In her eyes lay the recognition of years lost to misunderstanding, of a friendship or something more that had once held promise before drifting into distance. "I wish he had said it plainly," she murmured. "He tried," Hamish replied. "Folk often miss the truth when it's wrapped in fear." Priscilla knelt beside the box, brushing the top letter with careful fingertips. Her posture remained elegant, but her voice carried a quiet ache. He didn't deserve to die alone. Hamish hesitated, then placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. It was the gentlest of touches, respectful and brief, but enough to anchor her in the moment. Before either could speak again, Lugs growled low, not the restless whine of earlier, but a warning. His gaze fixed on the tree line above the shore. Hamish stood immediately. "Someone's there." A rustle followed, then the slow, hesitant emergence of Ewan McNeill, the crofter. His weathered face looked more troubled than ever, his clothes damp, his posture coiled with shame rather than threat. He froze when he saw the box in Hamish's hands. "I didn't mean," Ewan stammered, stepping back as though retreating would undo being seen. "I was only looking." Hamish kept his voice steady, low. "You knew about the letters." Ewan swallowed, eyes flicking toward Priscilla, with a mixture of guilt and longing for absolution he would never earn. "I found the stone months ago. Not the box, but signs of digging. Then Andrew came asking about the old boundaries, asking where secrets might sink deepest. I followed him, saw him come this way. I thought he'd uncover something that would ruin the Colonel, and if the Colonel fell, maybe others would look at my troubles differently." Hamish nodded, not judging, only listening. "So you watched. And when Andrew died, you thought the past would remain buried." Ewan's shoulders sagged. Then folk started talking. "I panicked. I never touched the man. I only feared what he'd reveal. I thought, if the letters disappeared, no shame would fall on the estate. Nor on me." Priscilla stepped forward, her face calm but solemn. "Ewan," she said quietly, "you should have trusted that truth doesn't ruin. It simply arrives." The crofter's eyes dropped. "I wasn't thinking straight. Shame twists a man." Hamish approached him, voice gentle but firm. "You weren't trying to harm Andrew. You were protecting your pride. but secrets pile up like wet peat. They only smother ye in the end. Ewan blinked hard, tears gathering. I'm sorry, truly. I only wanted the past to stay dead. Hamish shook his head slowly. Truth doesn't die because we wish it. Andrew knew that, and now ye do too. Ewan nodded miserably. Hamish stepped aside, giving him room to leave. No handcuffs, no threats. Only understanding mixed with disappointment, a punishment sharper than anything Blair could imagine. As Ewan retreated through the trees, Priscilla exhaled a shaky breath. You've always known how to speak to people, Hamish shrugged faintly. Folk talk if you let them. Priscilla looked at the letters again. What will you do with them? Hamish closed the box gently. Give them back to your father. Let him decide what to face, or hide. Priscilla nodded. Thank you, Hamish. He studied her in the soft morning light, her quiet strength, her shadows of regret, her dignity untouched yet more human than ever. There was more to say, there always was, but the wind shifted, carrying a cold breath from the loch that stirred the reeds around them. Hamish felt the story bending toward its final truth. A washed-out pale light hung over Lochdubh as morning broke, the kind that arrived shyly and offered little comfort. The night storm had left the air tasting faintly of metal and peat smoke, and thin mist drifted over the loch in ghost-like ribbons. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly along the damp village road, lugs pressing close to his leg. The dog's fur was still ruffled from the uneasy hours just past. The village itself felt subdued, as though Lochdubh were holding its breath. Hamish had spent little of the night sleeping. The truth of Andrew Kincairn's final moments had come to him in fragments. Ewan McNeill's shame, the broken earth by the boundary stone, the diary's quiet warnings. Bits of story settling piece by piece. Now, with the grey light softening the sharp edges of the hills, Hamish made his way toward the croft. Ewan McNeill was waiting outside as though he'd been standing there since dawn. His face looked older than it had days before, creased, worn, defeated. His hands trembled with a tension that had finally burned through to exhaustion. Hamish stopped a few paces away. Luggs sat beside him, ears angled toward the crofter. Ewan swallowed. Ye came. Aye, Hamish said softly. Best to finish what was started. Ewan let out a shaky breath. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I know, Hamish replied, but tell me all the same. Ewan rubbed both hands down his face, then began. He came by that night. Andrew. Raining, dark, the kind of night a man should stay by the fire. But he was restless, asking questions about the estate, the old stone, what folk hid and why. I told him to go home, but he wouldn't. Said some truths needed light, no matter how long they'd been buried. Hamish listened, patient, never interrupting. Ewan's voice cracked. He said if the colonel hid things, or if others used it against the family, Priscilla deserved to ken. He wasn't accusing me. He wasn't threatening. But I panicked. I thought he'd dig up my own shame. The letters I never should have read. The past I hoped would die with the old men who made it. Hamish's voice remained gentle. What happened on the shore? Ewan closed his eyes. We argued. I shoved him, only to stop him pushing past me down the path. I swear, Hamish, I swear it wasn't meant to hurt. But the stones were slick from the rain. He stumbled, fell. His voice thinned to a whisper. Into the water. Hamish pictured the scene. Not violence, but misjudgment. Not murder, but fear turned tragic. You didn't go after him? Hamish asked quietly. I did, Ewan cried. I tried. The water was churning. He went under before I could reach him. I shouted till my lungs burned. His shoulders collapsed. Then I ran, like a coward. Next morning I found his satchel on the path where he'd dropped it. Folk were already whispering about the empty boat. I panicked. I put the bag in the wee white boat, tucked it under the seat, hoping they'd think he'd taken it out himself. I only wanted folk looking the other way. Another foolish mistake. The wind carried a faint moan through the reeds. Hamish exhaled slowly. Ewan, shame makes fools of many. But ye did not set out to kill him. No, Ewan whispered, but he's dead because of me. Hamish nodded once, slow, sorrowful. Aye. Ewan wiped at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. What'll happen now? Hamish looked toward the distant hills, where weak sunlight tried half-heartedly to break through the clouds. "I'll tell it as it was. No lies, but no grand tragedy either. It was an accident born of fear. Folk understand fear." Ewan nodded miserably, then slipped back into his bothy as though the confession had taken the last of his strength. Hamish stood a moment longer, Lugs nudging his hand gently, sensing his master's quiet ache. The path back into the village wound between low stone walls and sodden grass. Lochdubh was stirring now. Thin chimney smoke, a door opening at Patel's shop, murmured voices. By the time Hamish reached the police station, a familiar thunder of heavy footsteps and foul mood preceded Blair's arrival. Blair stormed inside like a bull chasing a shadow. "Macbeth! Daviot wants a full explanation, and I'll tell you now, I am not pleased. There'll be consequences. Ye handled this whole case disgracefully." Hamish hung up his wet coat with slow precision. "I spoke with Ewan." Blair's eyes lit with hungry triumph. "A confession, finally, so it was murder, knew it. I'll be writing the press statement myself." "It wasn't murder," Hamish interrupted mildly. "It was an accident." Blair's face darkened to a dangerous shade. "Accident? The man's dead." "It was dark," Hamish said patiently. They argued. Andrew slipped. Ewan tried to save him. "You believe that rubbish?" Blair spat. "The crofter's a liar. Always has been." Hamish lifted a calm brow. "If he wanted to lie, sir, he'd have blamed someone else." Blair sputtered, unable to assemble a counter-argument, before snarling, "Daviot won't like this." "He'll like the lack of scandal," Hamish replied. "There's no murder, no conspiracy, just a sad misstep." Blair glared, then stomped out in a flurry of rage, muttering something about useless Highlanders. Anderson trailed after him, torn between sycophancy and unease. The storm had passed, the case was closed, yet Hamish felt no triumph in it, only the familiar ache of quiet tragedies that left no villains to blame. Later that afternoon, Priscilla arrived at the station. She stepped inside with her usual poise, though something gentler softened her expression. Hamish stood awkwardly, suddenly aware of the clutter near his desk, Lugs's shed fur on the floor, the faint smell of damp wool. "I heard," she said softly. Hamish nodded. Ewan panicked. Andrew slipped. Priscilla's gaze drifted to the window, where the loch shimmered faintly beneath a patch of thinning clouds. "He came to help me," she murmured. "All these years, and I thought he came to reopen old wounds." Hamish swallowed. Folks say what they can with the time they're given. She looked at him then, with gratitude, with sadness, with something resigned and unspoken. "Thank you, Hamish," she said, "for everything." Her voice held its usual cool restraint, but the warmth beneath it touched him more than she knew. "Will you stay a while?" he asked, immediately regretting the naked hope in his tone. Priscilla offered the faintest wistful smile. "No, I should return home. My father well, you know him." Hamish nodded stiffly. Aye, there it was, the familiar quiet distance that always settled between them, neither cruel nor cold, simply inevitable. She stepped out into the fading daylight. "Goodbye, Hamish." He raised a hand slightly. "Safe journey, Priscilla." And she was gone. The village dimmed into evening, cottages glowing against the encroaching blue-grey dusk. Hamish walked home with Lugs close beside him, each step softened by the settling quiet. Inside his cottage, the peat fire welcomed him with its low, comforting crackle. Lugs curled near the hearth with a heavy sigh, stretching out as though claiming his rightful place. Hamish shrugged off his coat, hung it by the door, and warmed his hands over the flames. A familiar melancholy rose within him, not sharp, not painful, but steady and known. The kind that came after cases like this, full of ordinary human failings rather than evil intent, full of sorrow rather than malice. He filled the kettle, set it on the hob, then sank into his chair beside the fire. The soft glow flickered across the room, touching the worn furniture, the mismatched mugs, the quiet, loyal dog who blinked sleepily at him. Hamish looked into the flames. "Another one come and gone, boy," he murmured, "and Lochdubh goes on." Lugs wagged his tail once, thumping the floor. Hamish smiled faintly. "We'll manage fine, won't we?" The fire crackled. The wind softened outside. brushing the cottage walls with gentle fingers. The quiet wrapped around him like an old, familiar blanket.